Kessler. I'm the Vice President of Agriculture and Horticulture, as well as Customer Success with Agrify. And I'm so pleased today to be joined by Miles Durham, one of the most talented head growers I've met here in Colorado, and a true compatriot in that we both have a special affinity for genetics and cannabis genetics and breeding. And I'm thrilled today that he has made the time to share his wisdom and insights with all of us. So Miles, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. You know, anytime to talk genetics.
I agree fully. So really, you know, what we're about here at Agrify is trying to teach and promote better ways of cultivation, give tips and tricks, as well as just talk about issues that might face a lot of growers. And one of the things that comes up invariably talking to any cultivator is the genetics that they select, the strains that they decide to grow. Whether you're a hobbyist, a home grower, or a large commercial enterprise, the varietals you choose have a huge impact on the products, obviously, that you offer, but additionally, how successful you are. There's a lot of genetics now that are getting what I would call kind of tired, Miles. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't, but everyone is always looking for the next new hybrid, what's hot. So Miles, when you're looking to select a new genetic, how do you even go about that process, from selecting a breeder to the varietal you choose? And then, yeah, why don't you share with us?
Yeah, so, you know, I lay a foundation of research. A lot of it begins with constant research. You need to know the breeders. You need to know how those breeding companies got formed, who they partnered with. You know, you need to know what they're about and their history, the strains that they produce. That's number one. You need to know the breeder and the information on who that is and how they breed and where they got their genetics from and how they got started. You know, a lot of breeders have one or two flagship strains and they started a whole line off that, but really maybe their flagship strain was the best. So you need to research the breeder first. When you have selected a genetic that you want to run, then that kind of comes into your world of phenotypical selection. You know, so when you're popping from seed, there's a lot of stuff you want to look for. A lot of it's specific to the grow and the grower. You know, when it comes to phenotype selection, you want to be looking at veg trait and flower trait. So phenotype hunting, pheno-hunting really starts playing as soon as the seed is germinated, because they definitely show their own traits even in veg too. And then that translates to flower when you're looking for trichome saturation, you're looking for terpene profiles, you're looking for yield, you're looking for easy to grow, not too much of a diva. If it's a home grow, maybe you're equipped to deal with plants that are a little more, you know, diva-ish. If it's a commercial grow, maybe you need something more hard. So there's a lot to look for. You know, we can go into specific details on any of those parts, but a lot of that goes into veg and flower traits and what kind of grow you're running, the environment you have, and what kind of personal traits you're looking for as a grower.
I love it, because you've hit on so many good things. I think we're going to have to unpack that quite a bit.
Let's do it, yeah.
You know, the truth is, you're right. I think a lot of both novices and people that might not be as experienced with breeding themselves focus a lot on the final flower produced, as if the phenotypic expression, the chemical profile of that one example, is the pinnacle of what that varietal does. But it's really not. It starts, like you said, in veg, when you might be looking at growth rate, root vigor, branching characteristics, internodal spacing. What other things, and let's go, you know, through the veg side and then into the flowering side, would you say you look for when you're selecting a new varietal to try?
Yeah, so, I mean, let's just talk about veg. I mainly look for growth in veg. Like, are ones growing faster? Are they growing healthier than others? They really start standing apart once they like go to 8 to 10 inches high, to 12 inches high. They really start showing their own little characteristics. So number one, I look at their phenotype expression. We're talking about their expressions, even in veg, that are relative to the environment. And those can change from environment to environment. That is a phenotypical trait. If you're talking about genotypical traits, that is a trait that the genetic expresses regardless of the environment that it is in. So I look for genotypical traits that I like, And then I also look for phenotypical traits specific to my growth. And in veg, I'm looking for rapid growth. I'm looking for ones that grow higher and faster and stronger than their baby sisters and brothers, ones that are custom to my environment better than other phenos, ones that like my nutrient program a little bit better than other phenos. So I'm hunting. At the same time, I'm keeping in mind what genotypical traits I want that genetic to have regardless of where it's at, but I'm also hunting them based on what works best for my specific environment.
Absolutely. And I think that understanding your particular cultivation environment, whether you're a large cultivator using double-ended high-pressure sodium lights and adequate HVAC, or you're maybe a hobbyist grower that, you know, is using a small LED in a grow tent, you need to know what you're capable of providing, and therefore you can match the growth of the plant, which is going to do well in the environment you can provide it. I've definitely taken in varietals that, whether it's cannabis or an orchid, you know, everyone else is growing and they're doing great, but then you get it into your particular environment and it languishes. It just doesn't express the way it did for other people. And that's because plants respond so much, and cannabis, as plastic as it is, as reactive to its environment as it is, the challenge is really that, you know, if you're not giving it the right environment and you can't manipulate your environment, maybe that's not the right strain for you. But what a lot of people, I think, get caught up in is a strain name, right? They hear that the newest thing that you want is the lemon cheese, and so you got to find lemon cheese. Someone says they have it, you get it, you grow it. It turns out to be either not what you were expecting or not produce as well as you thought. And there's lots of reasons for that. One of which is when you take a strain, let's say you're talking about Purple Punch, which is Granddaddy Purple and Larry OG as the parents. We all pretty much agree on that. Anytime you hybridize a Purple Punch, which is a Larry OG and a Granddaddy Purp, all of those seeds technically are Purple Punch. But all of those seeds are going to be genetically different. I love that you called them brothers and sisters, because that's what they are. They are separate male, female, possibly hermaphroditic, individual varieties. And they're all still Purple Punch. So when a grower picks out a variety and a particular pheno of that strain, that becomes a cultivar, right? That is a particular example of that strain or variety, and that is what is really unique and unfortunately gets lost a lot with cannabis growers. I mean, we've heard of Gelato 41, you might have heard of a couple of other specific cultivars, but mostly we talk about strains and we don't give enough credence to genetic selection for a particular cultivar. And that's what breeders are looking for. They're not just looking for any Purple Punch. Most of them probably not looking for Purple Punch much more anymore right now. But what they are looking for is a particular varietal example of a strain that has the traits that you're describing, whether that's vigor or yield or disease resistance, whatever it is. That's kind of what's driving their hunt. Now, when we talk about pheno-hunt, I think we should explain that, because you did a great job of explaining the difference between a phenotype, which is a genetic expression, and a genotype, which is a DNA or genetic characteristic. That being the case, when we talk about a pheno-hunt, we're really talking about starting a large number of the same variety and then examining the expression of both the phenotypic and genotypic traits and selecting the cultivar or cultivars that we want to use. So Miles, can you talk about, you know, I know when I was with you last, you had some really cool pheno hunts going, but can you talk about how you conduct a pheno hunt and the size of those hunts and how large you'd like them to be? I think that would be great for people.
Yeah, I'll kind of show you a little project we're pheno hunting right now. But just to touch on like the size and scale, you'll want to do as much as you can that your facility can handle. The more seeds you pop, the higher chance you have of finding that lottery winner. You know, so you want to, if it's a home grow, you know, do as much as you can. If it's commercial grow, do as much as you can. That's not going to affect production. You want to pop as many seeds and hunt as many lottery tickets as you can, as the facility can hold, while still keeping production. And when I talk about pheno hunting, I'll show you guys real quick.
Oh, that'd be great.
You know, Yeah, so, you know, among several strains, I'm hunting some secret cookies crossed with Kush Mint number 11 right now. And I'll show you some differences. You know, this plant right here is tall, lanky, but its sister right here is very short and bushy. You know, so that means that this plant right here is taking after its secret cookies lineage. And the short, bushier plant is taken after its Kush Mint lineage. You know, and I have 10 different secret cookies that I'm hunting at once. And I'm kind of, even though they're in veg, I'm treating every one like its own strain. They have to be numbered separately. They have to be hunted separately. They could be totally different. To the untrained eye, they could be two different strains for all they know. So I'm looking for ones that have long spacing, ones that are short and bushy. And I also want something different than other strains I'm pheno-hunting. I don't want a short, stocky ice cream cake and a short, stocky secret cookies. I want variation between my different strains that I have to offer. So at my facility, for instance, you know, I'm hunting about 10 to 15 established moms that are all different phenos of that strain. And we have about 7 to 8 strains right now that we're pheno hunting in that capacity. We have some Voltifiore genetics that we have 25 different seeds and 25 different phenos that we're hunting. And I'm cataloging the male traits just as much as the female traits because I'm a breeder at heart. I'm going to use those to breed and make things. So, you know, I look for a lot of stuff as far as tall and lanky, short and bushy. You know, and one other thing I wanted to show you guys, I'm going to give you a little secret breeder tip here.
Oh, when that's awesome.
Yeah. When you top your plant, there's a very, very high chance that that plant is going to start showing its sex organs early on, faster, and more specifically at the location you topped it at, you know? So, for example, these are some Voltifiore genetics. Okay, this whole table, there's 24, 25 different phenos here. And you can see that they were all topped pretty early on. And right where it's
Oh, I think we might. Oh, Miles, you're back. All right. Yeah,
you're
back, buddy.
Okay.
So
yeah,
you
so
were
I'm
saying
just,
right as where you topped it. So show us where you topped it, and then I think we'll be good.
I'll show you right here. All right. So this plant was topped on early on. It hasn't been put into flower yet, but it's still at the stage where we're probably going to take clones, number each genetic separately, and put them into production as flowers, phenotype, traits. And so what I wanted to show you guys is right here, right where we topped this plant, it's already showing its sex organs. So look, hey, don't steal my secret, but if you top a plant early in veg, you're going to notice that those plants show sex organs faster. They show them at the location you top them at, and that's going to allow you to sex these plants before having to wait till they all get into flower, you know? So that's a little tip that's going to help you guys out.
Awesome tip. And Miles, just to give some background to those listeners that might not be as experienced with cultivating, cannabis is a dioecious plant, meaning it has separate male and female plants represented, and occasionally a hermaphrodite that expresses both male and female traits, which is very undesirable because as a cultivator, we're usually targeting sinsemilla flower or seedless flower. So we want all female plants, no strains or signs of a male, because that would lead to pollination, which would lead to unwanted seed. Not that seed is bad, but when you don't want seed, it is. And so being able to sex a plant to see whether it's male or female, as you're describing, seeing those sex organs earlier, means that you can either separate the females for further production use, or if you're a small grower and you're not interested in breeding, you can eliminate the males, which gives you back some of that bench space. But I think that what was key that you showed us is the swath of the number of seeds that you look for a particular variety, because ultimately, when you look at genetics, it's a bell curve of expression. You have hundreds and thousands of DNA pairs, 25 to 30,000 different DNA pairs for most plants and animals. So cannabis is right up there. And with that many different gene pairs, there's a lot of different variability, a lot of different chemical expression, phenotypic expression that can happen. So the larger number of seeds that you start, the more of a chance you have of finding something, as you described, as the lottery ticket, which is the stuff at the very far end of the bell curve, where we really get excited. Because if you start 5 seeds, you know, you have a pretty good chance of finding something good. But if you start 10 seeds, maybe you'll find something great. But if you start 1,000 seeds, the likelihood, just mathematically, that you'll find a unique cultivar that expresses all of the desirable traits you want, whether that's vigor, disease resistance, yield, terpene profile, chemical profile, stature, size. It increases. So the more you can start, the more you can hunt, the better. And we have a question from the audience. What is the difference between a strain and a cultivar? So unfortunately, it's a great question, but cannabis doesn't follow traditional horticulture taxonomic structure, right? So because it was illegal, because it was black market, they just didn't adopt the same kind of standard naming practices. So when you cross two unique varieties or strains, it creates a new strain. So that's where we were talking about taking Larry OG and Granddaddy Purple, and all of the progeny become Purple Punch. Now, if I then grow out 2,000 seeds and Mile grows out 2,000 seeds, and we select the best example of Purple Punch that we've ever seen, hopefully, then that particular variety might be Mile's best, and that's a cultivar because it's both the strain Purple Punch, but denotes a specific plant. And typically when growers, breeders are propagating and sharing genetics, they're sharing cuttings, which are vegetative propagations of the same plant. So if you take a mother plant and you take a cutting from it, it's an identical copy. It'll have the same traits and overall the same phenotypic expression in the same environment. Whereas if you start from seeds, the variance is going to be pretty more widespread depending on how well stabilized that particular variety is. Maybe that's something we should talk about, Miles, because you did a great job of talking about doing research on your breeders and understanding their particular lines. A line would be a strain that a breeder has worked on for a period of time that they've quote unquote made their own, whether that's an inbred line or a stabilized line. You'll also see a lot of, you know, some of the newer entrants into breeding, unfortunately, maybe called pollen chuckers or something negative like that, where they might not have as much experience. But when we look to stabilize a variety, there's a couple of things that we can do. And, you know, do you want to talk about that, Miles? Do you want me to introduce those topics? Okay.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Just to touch on strain and cultivar differences. A strain simply describes the overall makeup of what that cannabis strain is. You know, just like you said, Purple Punch, it's made up of something specific. That is what the strain is. A cultivar is a pheno hunted out of that strain that someone has deemed a winner and is going to be mass produced, whether at home or a commercial grow or whatever. So that is the difference between a cultivar and a strain. When we talk about stabilization, let's use Wedding Cake for an example by Seed Junkie. You know, Seed Junkie released Wedding Cake, then Wedding Cake F2, Wedding Cake F3, Wedding Cake F4. That is showing a breeder who has hunted a cultivar of his own out of his own genetics and then deemed it worthy of stabilization. So he's taking his Wedding Cake female cut and crossing it back to his parent, his original male, to stabilize those phenotypical expressions. So he's picked a female pheno that he likes, and he will continually back cross it to the male to produce F2, F3, F4 generations that are more and more stable. So when you buy seeds of something that's been stabilized, you're going to expect very few differences in those seeds. A lot of those phenos you hunt will be similar.
You know, and that's great for people. Yep.
Yeah, and that's great for people who want that. They expect his cut of Wedding Cake and they want to cut like that. That's great. For you know, for a breeder like me, I like a lot of variety. I want all those phenos to be as different as possible. You know, but that's kind of the difference between something that's been stabilized versus something that is not. You know, and that's kind of up to the breeder's choice.
You gave a great example. I think you were looking at the Voltafiore strains, and then afterwards you were also showing us the Secret Cookies Cushman's cross. Now, Cushman's is a strain. It's a varietal. Cushman's 11 was a specific cultivar that was hunted, deemed to have special properties, and as such, then the breeder took explicit amounts of time to then stabilize that. What you were describing was filial backcrossing, where you take a progeny, you backcross it to the mother, And just to explain to our listeners, think about it like this. When I hybridize two parents, I have a mom and a dad, it's roughly a 50% of both of their DNA that gets expressed. Random parts of their DNA, but still 50-50. When I take one of those filial generation, F1s, and I cross it back to the mother or father, I then increase the genetic potential or similarity to that parent from 50-50 to 75-25. And over successive generations, you can get it to where you're 97, 98% that particular parent, meaning out of 100 seeds, you should have, plus 90% uniformity or homogeneity. One breeder, old school guy, is very well known for naming a strain Cindy 99 after he very handily achieved a 98.7% uniformity. And, thank God for breeders like that early on that took work into their own hands, stabilize those varieties. DJ Short, an old school guy, did a great paper on cubing, a different and similar style of back crossing filial generations and then picking new progeny and back crossing those. And so lots of ways you can stabilize the varieties, but ultimately the goal of a stabilized variety is really what? A high quality flower with more uniformity than you would get on a random strain hybrid where you would expect a lot of diversity. So when you're starting to think about stabilizing or breeding, Miles, what is it, we talked about some of the vegetative traits. Let's get into some of the flowering traits that get kind of exciting. I mean, behind me, I have a research article or an excerpt that's talking about how you breed varieties for specific traits like high myrcene, which is a very common terpene in cannabis. What kind of traits are you looking for when you're looking at flower that's growing or new varietals that you're pheno-hunting?
Yeah, so there's major and minor traits. It's like the three pillars of success. It's trichome saturation, terpene profile, and yield. If you get a pheno that is A+ or S class on yield and terpene percentages and trichome saturation, and by that I mean potency, that is a winner, and the minor details are, does it like the environment? Is it happy? Is it easy to grow? Does it respond to my nutrient program well? Those are the minor details, but the three pillars of success on a pheno worthy of stabilization is trichome saturation, terpene percentages, and yield.
You can always use other genetics to make a plant more hardy or more resistant, but like you're pointing out, those three pillars are traits that if they don't express, you're never going to have an upper echelon or a very sought after varietal. So other things that you might look at, are they disease resistant as a minor trait? Are they pest resistant? Some plants just seem to be spider mite like homing beacons. Others, you can have in a room full of mites, it'll be the only plant that they don't seem to go after. And little understanding traits like that really are critical in choosing not just one parent to hybridize for fun, but for an experiment or a breeding program. And that's something I think that we should kind of talk about. When I look, understand, I cultivated cannabis for many years, and then I grew orchids and fell in love with orchids, and now I have the opportunity to do both. But what I got was a little bit of jealousy, because when I was growing orchids, we had a repository of information that went back to 1854 over at the Royal Horticultural Society in London. And that meant every cultivar, every strain that was ever bred, I had who did it, what the flower looked like. Before photographs, they actually painted every single flower so you could see. So I knew what was going to happen when I took a big red cattleya and a big purple one and bred them together. With cannabis, we don't have that database. We have a lot of information in some of our most established and longest surviving cultivation members. This is not a long-term occupation, or at least wasn't 20 years ago. Now you have an opportunity where people are doing this at a much larger scale and really doing it right, where they can do large pheno hunts and breeding programs But what I haven't seen as much of, and I'm starting to now by groups like Violta Fiore, like you're talking about, is what's called a directed breeding program, where instead of saying, I have this amazing Cushman, and I also have this really cool grease ball. And because I have both of them, I'm going to cross them together and I'll get grease mints. I don't know. Well, that's good. And your likelihood, since you had two really exceptional strains, is that you would get a pretty good result. But instead of doing that, a directed breeding program would be where we say, okay, we are going to breed for trichome saturation. Only caring about trichome saturation, we are going to focus on that. We will widen out those other traits we want after, but with a sole focus on a particular trait, you can start looking at which cultivars have an additive effect or where they enhance the trichome production of another cultivar. And so it's pretty interesting to start looking at directed breeding programs because we're getting into these bigger professional cannabis breeding opportunities now. You know, there's a group in California that's doing a pheno mega hunt with like 10,000 seeds. And when you look at the difference of what you can find in a pack of 10 versus a pack of 10,000, it's pretty amazing. Excited to see where that goes. But have you done any breeding, Miles? And have you done specifically breeding towards a directed trait? And I'm curious as to what traits kind of excite you. Is it the terpenes, the cannabinoids? What kind of gets you going?
I'm pretty picky. You know, I don't continue to work with a genetic or a pheno unless it hits all three categories for me. You know, to talk about the strains that are resistant, I call those bulletproof strains. You know, the grease ball, for example, is a plant that can be right up next to plants that have powdery mildew. It'll have zero. You know, bulletproof genetic traits are something that, you know, we really look for. And just to touch on what you're talking about. So I have definitely breeded before. I've created my own strains. And, you know, that particular breeding program was for terpenes. I wanted to add a citrus and tangy to the strains I had already picked out. But so much work and so much decision-making goes into your breeding program before you ever start, because you have to find the right genetics to start with as your foundation. If you have weak, unhunted genetics, I don't care how you breed them, you're not going to fulfill your full potential. So a lot of it is choosing the right strain. And when I say strain, I'm not talking about pheno. You know, when you breed, you created a strain. You did not create a cultivar. Breeding programs are multi-step, long-term processes, you know, and I'm so glad that we could talk about this kind of stuff, because in the nationwide industry of cannabis production, there are many amazing growers and amazing, capable guys growing weed and looking into it and how to do it better. But there is a void of genetic discussion, of strain discussion, and why genetics matter and how they can change the game of cannabis industry. So I'm in the middle of another breeding program right now where I have carefully selected the genetics that I want to work with. I know that I'm going to use the secret cookies crossed with Cushman's. I'm using a male out of that. And I've selected the ice cream cake, the Sunday driver, the mimosa, and a couple other hand-picked phenos that I have hunted from seed to be a part of that program. So much work goes into your breeding program before you ever start. You know, that's very, very important. And just to talk about this one topic,
please,
you guys need to be aware and careful of the cash out syndrome. Okay, there are a lot of amazing breeders out there, but almost all of them are in the cash out phase. Okay, and I'm not talking bad about any of these breeders, but I'm going to use some for an example. Okay, and I'm talking to people who are thinking about buying seeds, who are thinking about breeding. You need to hear this. Okay, Canorado Genetics, for example, they came out with their Sunday driver, derived from their Grape Pie and Fruity Pebbles OG. That was one of their flagship strains. They started their whole company and their whole genetic lineup on strains like their Sunday driver, but now you can see they are producing 10s, 20s, 50s different strains all crossed with the same thing. That is what I call cash out syndrome. They are trying to cash out on their popularity. They're trying to create as many strains and seeds as possible. They're not hunted. They're not stabilized. So what I look for—
they're not directed.
Exactly. So what I look for is the company's original strain. I want their flagship original strain, and I don't want any of their cash out strains. So for Colorado genetics, I don't care about any of the crap they're putting out. I want their Sunday driver. For Capulator genetics, I don't want all of those Mac crosses and the frozen lemonade crosses.
You just
I want
Mac
the original
1.
Mac. I want the original Mac from seed. You know, there's a lot of guys, a lot of companies that are cashing out and trying to sell as many seeds and make as much money as possible, but you need to find their original foundational strains if you really want to work with and breed with those kind of things.
Let's talk about that, because I think that warrants some discussion. One, because I think a lot of people, hobbyists and commercial alike, do what we're talking about, which is hunt seeds and have to choose breeders. But I think that what you're describing, the cash out phase, is where someone collects well-known cultivars and or finds them themselves, and then, you know, if they've been working a line, we'll take the Sunday driver line for a while. Let's say it's taken them 6 years to stabilize that variety. They put a lot of time and effort into it, which is what it takes. But at that point, if then they take that and they reverse it, feminized plant, turn to a male, and then they take 20 other varieties that they have collected, cultivars that are exceptional, don't get me wrong, but not something that they have themselves stabilized or bred, and they put it in a room with this reversed plant, then you get 20 different crosses, right? And they're all pollinated by this one plant, this reversed male, reversed female, that expressed male. And the challenge there is those are all brand new crosses. And like we discussed, you'll find some winners, you'll find some losers, but it's not the same as a signature strain. That signature strain, that strain that breeder knew inside and out, that worked for multiple years so that they could breed it back and stabilize that variety or stabilize particular traits, you know, it's just not the same. And so I totally understand why you as a breeder would collect the worked lines. That's what interests you. You can cross your own, you can make your own hybrids, but finding the variety that took someone 6 years to stabilize, that's actually special.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then, you know, it's kind of interesting. We're talking about these different ways that breeders might go about, you know, making new varieties. And listen, there's nothing wrong with offering a lot of different varieties. People want variety, they want cutting edge. But there is a difference in the expectation of a seed cross, a cash out cross, as you described it, versus an inbred line. And so I would say that if someone gave you the opportunity to get, say, the Pacific Northwest inbred huckleberry, that would be much more attractive than just picking up a new lava cross seed or even a clone that, you know, Finest might have hunted out in California. It's just not the same in terms of what that can bring to a program or into a breeder's hands.
Yeah, exactly. There's just, you have to be very careful about the strains that you pick. You know, if the company's pumping out 50 strains a year, they're obviously cashing out. You know, you just need to be super careful. And a commercial grow like me, when I came here and I upgraded their entire genetic library, which is kind of what I do now, you know, every single strain has been hunted from seed by me, but handpicked carefully. You know, our alien sour apple, that's an alien rock candy crossed with a sour apple IBL. I would challenge anyone to find that sour apple IBL strain. And that's just for an example. So just be extremely careful and do your research. It takes so much research and constant discussion over what strains you want to pick. You know what I mean?
100%.
I just can't stress that enough.
And let's talk about it, because look, let's say you do a pheno hunt, Miles. You found a real winner. It's from seed. Then the battle's not over. You don't just start cloning that and putting it into production. Generally, we stress test, right? Like, breeders are known, because a seed has a taproot and a clone generally doesn't have quite as vigorous a root system to start off from, because it doesn't have a taproot. It's a forced root system of fibrous roots. And so typically when I've talked to breeders and growers alike, they'll select their cultivar, but then they want to run it from clone once and make sure that the clone flower produced is equal or better than the seed flower. And then just to make sure it wasn't an accident, they'll run it again, right? So now you've spent 3 growth cycles, making sure that this particular variety lives up to your expectations. Have you seen instances where, you know, it worked great from seed, but the clones are just kind of dogs?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we talk about the third generation stabilization when we're talking about this. And what I mean by that is, number one, you want to pheno-hunt these strains in the facility that you're growing them. Certain strains will like greenhouses better than indoor. They'll like indoor better than outdoor, yada, yada. So it would behoove you to hunt these strains in the environment and the grow that they're going to be produced in. That's number one. Number two is you just need to be careful about jumping the gun on the first generation. You know what I mean? I always preach to people that you need to make your moms out of the third generation of that genetic. So what that means is pop a seed, pheno hunt out of all those seeds. And when you choose that winner, you need to run it 3 times to make sure it generally stabilizes itself and it doesn't herm. And by herm, I'm talking about you need to be watching for female flowers and male balls at the same time type of herm, and also the late flower banana type of herm. And 2 different types of herm, both are undesirable. You need to give things 3 generations. The 3rd generation is the magic number for a new strain. That's what you want to make your moms out of. And, you know, maybe we even need to touch on genetic drift, genetic washout, genetic maintenance. You know, so it's just very important that you give those things 3 generations before you make moms and put it in mass production.
Okay, so there's now like a ton more stuff we got to talk about, Miles.
Yeah.
First, you know, we can talk genetic drift, but I think that's in a minute. I think stress testing is really key. You're talking about running 3 generations, the rule of 3. I think that's beautiful advice. You know, I know breeders that will take a particular male before they'll use it in breeding. They'll grow it in a solo cup until the thing is 4 feet tall, make sure that they don't water it till it drops to the ground, bring it back. What they're doing is trying to abuse the plant so that if by chance it is unstable in other people's environments, that they learn that early on instead of putting forth a male pollen that could lead to a lot of intersex traits. And when we talk about intersex traits, I think you just hit them on the head. Why don't you go through the 2 different types that we just talked, where, you know, there's difference between hairs and balls as well as the nanners. So, you know, take at it, man.
Yeah, I mean, and dude, a lot of that has to do with genetic washout, okay? You know, everyone should be stress testing. If you're a true pheno hunter, I know it goes against your heart and it might not be very fun to stress a plant out like that. But the fact of the matter is that stuff is going to happen from time to time in a grow. Yeah. And you don't want to establish a strain, make moms, put her in mass production only to have an entire section herm out because you never stress tested it. You know, so you don't have to stress test the whole section, but you need to have like 4 or 5 copies. And again, like, make them starve for water, maybe mess with the light cycle a little bit, mess with the temperatures a little bit, you know, and really kind of ironclad that strain so you don't shoot yourself in the foot. And, you know, that translates to herm traits. You need to be watching for herm traits in flower where the flower is also growing male balls at the same exact node location, and also stress testing them in late flower to see if you can get those things to nanner or put out bananas, because those things will also put out pollen and ruin your entire crop. So stress testing is very important.
It's vital. And just so in case people are listening that might not be as familiar with sexing a plant, when Miles is talking about female flowers and male balls, you have to appreciate the female flower comes out of the calyx, and there's 2 female hairs called stigmas, which are the reproductive surfaces pollen would land on. 2 hairs, 1 calyx equals 1 female flower. A male flower kind of opens up like a bit of a lobster claw and then opens to a 4-petal flower. And it looks, when it's hanging, kind of like a cluster of grapes or a cluster of lobster claws, hence the balls hanging, right? And typically where you'll see that, you'll see the female flower at the crux of a branch coming up. The male flower will hang down at the exact same location. So when you say be diligent as a cultivator looking for those traits, you're literally going through every little node, every branch, making sure that they're not accidentally you know, going to seed your entire room down the road.
Yeah, and again, it's important to remember that if a plant herms out, it might not happen all over the plant. It's very likely that just a couple branches have herm problems, you know? So if you're not examining the entire plant, literally every node, and you miss 1, 2 nodes that are growing male sex organs, you know, that could cause huge problems. So just keep in mind that these can happen at just a few nodes of the plant. It might not be the whole plant that herms out.
Just remember, a male flower can produce tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pollen grains, and each pollen grain represents one seed. It's not like one flower is one seed in your room and it's not a big deal. I mean, you could lose an entire facility to just a couple of male flowers.
Yeah, 1 to 2 males can pollinate an entire facility, and that pollen sticks around too.
Yeah, it's tough to get rid of. Miles, talk to people about what bananas are. I don't know if everyone else, you know, fully appreciates. I know what you're talking about, but I think that it would be helpful if we just kind of explain that term too.
Yeah, so you normally see this in late flower. It's a secondary herm trait. It's long, thin, light green to yellow looking bananas that stick out of the flower. They're morphed and mutated male reproductive organs that can still put out pollen. So number one, that's showing you a genetic trait that is unstable. That is a warning, that is a red flag that you should probably cut that genetic out. Number two, that has the ability to pollinate itself and other plants around it. So there's 2 huge red flags that bananas can cause. And, you know, that's late flower stress. That's an unstable genetic trait. And it's a secondary herm that you need to be looking for in, like, you know, week 5, 6, 7, 8.
Yeah, a lot of people spend a lot of energy looking for those early balls and hairs, but late in flower, they even sometimes choose to let it go. And unfortunately, what I've seen is it can produce a lot of those micro preemie seeds, those bananas, where you might not even get this widespread burst of pollen, but throughout each bud cluster, you end up with just tens of hundreds of these itty bitty premature tan seeds. It's impossible to get them out, and it ruins the flavor of the crop. It lowers the quality. I think that growers and breeders alike have to be diligent with, you know, removing those plants that exhibit those late flowering male traits. I know it hurts when you're 3 weeks from harvest to say, you know, I'm just going to get rid of this guy, but it's a guy. Don't let it affect all the girls in the room. So I think that's a brilliant piece of advice and something to be aware of. Let's talk about this, Miles. Once you've found a pheno you love, you've hunted a batch of 100 seeds, you've done 3 rounds. This is a rock solid variety. It has all 3 pillars. What else can you do by manipulating its environment to improve that strain? I mean, at that point, are you just, is good enough, or are you still trying to maximize its genetic potential?
I guess it depends. You know, at a commercial production facility, when I deem a pheno worthy of mass production, I'm just going to give it the best life I can give it. I'm done stress testing it. I've set the 3rd generation, and it's ready for mass production. So I'm not going to mess with it too much. I feel that if I see a strain or a pheno that is high potency, high terpenes, high yield, and maybe even has some bulletproof traits, then that strain's worthy of mass production. When you're talking about using strains like that for breeding, there's a little preview step I like to do when I breed. And, you know, this is another tip for anyone who might think about breeding, is that when you cross your selected male with those selected females, it's going to give you a preview window of what those strains are going to smell and taste like as they're crossed. So what I'm talking about is males will produce terpenes along with the pollen, okay? So when you have 4 or 5 different females in there and you pollinate with that male in week 3 to 4 to 5, it's going to give you a short window of a preview of those male terpenes that are on the female plants. And you can actually rub those female plants that have been pollinated, and only for about a week or 2, it'll show you what it's going to smell and taste like. So for example, I crossed the greaseball and several other strains with a tangy pheno I hunted out of Strawberry Fields. So that greaseball is real nice and grapey and musky, but when I pollinated it with that tangy male, I was able to get in there and test it and see, and it had such a nice tangy and grape and musky smell, and that window only lasts for about a week. So when you're talking about strains that hit all 3 pillars, I either deem them worthy of mass production or worthy of breeding. And when we move into a breeding program, I kind of like to do that little trick when you pollinate to go back in a few days after, and it'll give you like a terpene and taste test of what the two strains combined might look like. And then if I like what that exact tastes like or smells like, those are the traits I'm going to look for when I pheno-hunt out of those seeds.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think enough can't be said that people spend so much time selecting the female variety for breeding that unfortunately males sometimes get left out. But you can learn a lot about a male plant by letting it go to full maturity. Maybe not in your garden. Maybe it has to go outside or has to go off site. But when you see not just a couple of male flowers open, but full clusters, I mean, we're talking large heads of grapes that are pretty big. They form buds just the way that the female flower does, just not quite the same looking. You can see trichome development. You can smell terpenes. You can rub the stem of the plant and kind of get a feel for how trichome heavy it is going to be, as well as whether or not it's going to be oily or it's going to be very floral or aromatic. And you have to look at those traits when you're going to be using it. That's why I think it's an easy sidestep to feminize a female plant and force it to be male, because you already know that it's going to have the traits for flower that you're looking for. But a lot of the time, feminized seed has a higher likelihood of hermaphroditism and a lot more variability, whereas a male-female produced strain or variety is going to generally be more stable. And so, you know, doing that research on those males is absolutely key. Spending the time to get to know your plants and not just one-off it is key to, you know, a really successful long-term breeding program.
Yeah, we're talking about cutting corners here. You can't cut corners. And again, I'm going to speak a little bit on my personal preference. Please. I know a lot of guys out there, they love feminized seeds. I understand the pros to feminized seeds. I am vehemently against feminized seeds. Again, that's my personal opinion. That's how I feel in my own heart. But feminized seeds are not natural. They are not produced that way in nature. And they do not represent the originality of cannabis and how it is produced in nature and the natural way of things happening. I like to follow the natural way of things happening, a male pollinating a female. I don't like applying colloidal silver or whatever else have you and reversing females to make them, that seems unnatural to me. And I don't like what I see from feminized seeds. I see weak strains. I see mutated strains. I just don't like feminized seeds. And I try to preach to everyone not to use feminized seeds, to use regular seeds, learn females and males. And if you don't want to use the males, then cut them and kill them. But we're talking about cutting corners here. You cannot cut corners. And again, to touch on that, when you're talking about flowering males out, I know it's a lot of work to flower males out fully. And I know you don't get very much from it, but it has to be done. Males tell you so much in like flower. They tell you how much yield they're going to produce. They tell you what smells and terpenes they're going to produce, their trichome saturation. They even form their own colas, and there's so much to learn from those males. And if you're not flowering them out and hunting those traits, and you use that male to cross a whole breeding line with, you never really did yourself or your customers due diligence at all. So no. It is extremely necessary to flower your males out completely when you're hunting your males. Now, if you want a little shortcut, I'll give you a shortcut and get some vials or some pollen bags or some way of harvesting pollen, and you harvest pollen off each one of those males. And when you get a male winner that you like, you already got pollen that you can apply to your females. And that allows you to flower them fully out and then still use the pollen, so you don't have to do an entire another round of breeding. But you better flower your males out as many as you can side by side to finish flower. Collect the pollen of the one you want, or even all of them midway through flower. And then when you pick it, you have some pollen you can breed with. But do not take a shortcut and just use a male that you had in beds to start a whole breeding line off of. You have to do your due diligence. You owe it to yourself and to everyone who's going to get seeds from you.
Absolutely. And I think that you brought up pollen storage, and we should give everybody just a little hint, right? So if you want to store pollen, you collect the pollen, which normally would drop. So you want it in a fairly windless environment, or you're just going to throw very fine pollen all over. Collect the pollen, put it in a dry, sealed, I prefer a plastic vial, some sort of desiccant in there, even a couple of beads of those desiccation packs, because you don't want pollen to mold because there is a moisture content to it. And then I personally would put it in the refrigerator in a dark place, a cool place, and it can live a couple of years like that. And then
Yeah.
you can bring it out with a Q-tip and just kind of put it where you want it, when you want it, after you've done the diligence on making sure that that pollen is worthy for your program.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to mix a little flour in there. You know, whatever you need to do to keep that pollen isolated and dry and away from all moisture, it's okay to do things like that, you know. So there's several techniques that work.
Absolutely. Miles, we have a question from one of our listeners. They're asking, thank you, this has been really interesting. Can you read a male plant to know more about that particular strain? And I think that what they're saying is, how do you look at a male? We talked about the phenotypic expression and some of the desirable veg and flower traits for female plants when we're growing them. What do you look for, as the listener is saying, how do you read a male, right? Like, is it branch structure? Is it tightness of the male flowers? How do you do it?
Yeah, I mean, so in veg, they're almost identical to the female traits you look for. You want a plant that's not susceptible to deficiencies, that processes potassium and phosphorus well, that has nice, thick, healthy green stalks as opposed to weak purple stalks, nodal spacing, and again, and even personal preference traits that you're hunting. Like I said earlier, do I want a male that shows its Cushman's properties, or do I want a male that shows its secret cookies properties? Yeah. One or the other isn't better than the other one, but you need to have a personal goal of what you're hunting. So that's why it's very, very important. You know the strain makeup of what you're hunting and what those strains look like, what Cushman's look like, what secret cookies look like. You know, if you're hunting mimosa, do you want a clementine pheno? Do you want a purple punch pheno? Even though one's not better than the other, you need to know the strains of that strain makeup so that when you pheno hunt, you know which phenos are reproducing those sub-strain phenotype traits. You know, and in flower, it's much different. I'm looking for big male flowers. I'm looking for big male colas. And again, they're going to show you if they're yielders or if they don't have yield traits. I'm looking for tight spacing. I want something that's going to stack like a baseball bat. I want something that has nice colors. Males will turn gold and yellow and orange and purple and show color traits. I want something like that too, you know? And I want to see what its trichome saturation is like. Those male pollen sacs need to be covered in trichomes. They need to be stinky and tasty. I want terpenes on those males. So a lot of traits are identical to female traits you hunt, but again, some are male specific in late flowers, such as stacking, cola size, trichome saturation, the terpenes and color profiles that male can offer.
So it sounds like there's a lot of traits that have to be monitored that are the same for females and males, but as you get a little bit more proficient and comfortable with late term male flowering, you'll be able to read some of those nuanced traits a little bit more successfully. Now, one of the things that I love about genetics is the diversity. It is the hunt, right? I can buy a clone and I can buy that variety. I've had that variety. It's not that interesting to me. When I start 20 new seeds or 100 new seeds, that to me represents varieties that no one's ever had before. It's a combination of DNA that is unlikely to have been expressed anywhere else. And you get the opportunity for new aromas and new flavors. There was a plant that unfortunately is no longer with us that, I swear had trichomes that were the size of granulated sugar crystals. I mean, painful. If you got it on your finger, it was like sandpaper. There are other varieties that have aromas that I didn't even know were possible. The idea of a fermented watermelon being really aromatic and smelling good, it might be counterintuitive. But I think that where we have to get to from a breeding perspective is an appreciation for that diversity, and also a desire to maximize the genetic potential. Once you've selected a variety, once you've stabilized it, if you're a commercial grower, then it needs to be commercially viable. And Miles, you did a great job of describing what makes a strain commercially viable that might not be, otherwise only viable to a hobbyist, a collector, an individual.
Yeah.
But personally, where I see a lot of excitement in the industry is in the breeding side, but also we're starting to get more scientific research in the cannabis cultivation industry as a whole. Really has only come out into the light, no pun intended, in the last 10, 12 years. You know, early in California, maybe a little bit more open, but it used to be on the black market, loose lips, sink ships, and send people to jail. And so there wasn't this adoption of modern scientific theory and practice. And now we're starting to get some really cool stuff, whether it's manipulating your vapor pressure deficit so that you can provide a better growing environment, or whether it's changing the light quality or intensity to elicit the production of different metabolites. Like one of our cultivators just did an experiment and using a particular light type after years of growing a genetic, it was the first time this thing made terpenoline. And it didn't make a little, it made almost a full % of terpenoline. And before it had never done that. So there's a lot of optimization that one can do if they have control over their cultivation environment, something that we feel really strongly about at Agrify, and it's why we use the VFUs as a very highly controlled environment. But it's also about exploring, right? So if you can take a great cultivar and make it better, that is fantastic. You can use the environment, for example, to stimulate anthocyan production. I mean, Miles, you know as well as I, Purple Genetics, you know, they have their own unique flavor profile, but they have a driving commercial force in that people love the color.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that, you know. There's a market for people who love bag appeal weed that's purple and, you know, fruity and all that. I would say that just remember that there are some strains that the best thing about them is their high and how they make you feel. You know, that's one thing about Volta genetics that are just great, that, yeah, it looks great, smells great, tastes great, all that good stuff. But the best thing about that weed is it's high. So if you're the kind of person that likes bag appeal and beautiful weed and tastes great, great. But if you're a person that's looking for weed that the best thing about it is the high, there's a whole category of genetics that too, where the breeders have focused on how that flower makes you feel and how it enhances your life. And those are the traits that they're hunting. And Dave, you're touching on something beautiful here. You're touching on something like that's a hidden gem of the genetic industry right now. What people need to realize is that this cannabis industry is very young. A lot of things have not been discovered yet. A lot of techniques and growing methods and breeding methods have not been discovered yet. There are golden nuggets out there that are up to us to dig up and change the face of the industry. It is young enough that there are discoveries to be made that will change the face of this game several times over. That will happen several times in the next 10 to 20 years. So
absolutely,
don't treat this industry like it's you know, the orchid industry, for example. This has not been tried and true and tested for generations and generations. There are things to discover about this industry, and it can be you. You know, just me or you or anyone out there can discover something amazing and unique to this industry. So it is young, and there are many, many things that we're going to learn and grow and discover as we keep dedicating ourselves to this work, you know. And I think something beautiful is happening in the U.S. is that there is a genetic race almost in the United States. There are more breeders and more breeders who are getting in the genetic world and are trying to create custom, unique, one-off, world-class genetics. And I think the United States is kind of becoming a leader of the world in genetic development. So that's something that's really exciting. I don't think that's happening anywhere else. You know, in European countries, they're more old school, old world genetics. In the U.S., something is amazing happening right now. We're in the middle of a genetic discovery overall. Exactly. That's the perfect term for it. So
it is a true renaissance.
Beautiful.
And just to add to that, because I truly share that sentiment, Miles, which is what you're starting to see are regional pockets of growers, right? We talked a little bit about the black market hindered sharing of information, but within smaller subsets, that variety, those strains, that lineage or knowledge base was shared. And so you had pockets in Florida, you had pockets in the Northeast, you had a Michigan pocket, a Pacific Northwest, a California, not so much in Nevada, but definitely a Colorado contingent. And what's happening now is you're taking these groups that have been individually working their own lines, and all of a sudden it's coming to the public. And so there's all of these new genetic opportunities and stabilized varieties, things that people have put a lot of time into. And now we're just starting to get to the excited part, seeing that it is actually the combination of those genetics coming together and the new varieties that they hold and the possible future. And I'm getting dinged that we're out of time, Miles. This has been so much fun.
Oh man,
I think
we're gonna have to keep going another time, dude.
We're definitely gonna have to do this again. Talking about the Renaissance can be an entire episode in and of itself.
Yeah.
So, Miles, thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge, your experience with us. And I'd love to have you back on again really soon. This has been super fun. Very educational.
I feel like we just barely scratched the surface.
We'll definitely do it again, man, for sure. Awesome. So again, I can't thank you enough. I can't wait to see what your pheno-hunting produces. And until next time, everybody, this is David Kessler with Agrify. Have a great day. Take care.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Miles. Bye.
See you, Dave.